Do you believe in reincarnation? What if we tell you right now that there are real documented cases that prove exactly that? If you're thinking that nothing comes after death, and that there has to be a logical explanation for everything, then we're already very curious how you explain these 10 mysterious cases. So let's jump straight into the first case, and this one will change your perception of life and death forever. Number 10, the mysterious case of Edward Austrian. The case of Edward Austrian is by far one of the most fascinating and at the same time most mysterious reincarnation stories ever, especially because this isn't just about memories, but about intense fear, physical pain, and shocking details that align astonishingly well. Edward was still a small boy when his parents noticed that he reacted extremely strongly to certain things. Dark, gloomy, rainy weather frightened him deeply. Even dark clouds or the mere sound of rain were enough to make him nervous and panicked. At the same time, he suffered from severe, unexplained throat pain that kept returning and became increasingly distressing over time. Doctors found no explanation, no inflammation, no infection, no visible diagnosis. Yet Edward complained of pain so intense that at times he no longer wanted to speak. For the medical professionals, this was a mystery, because physically everything appeared to be fine. And now things get truly unsettling. At around 4 years old, Edward began talking about things no one would expect from a child that age. He spoke of another life, of a terrible war, and of places he knew in striking detail. He described trenches where it rained constantly, mud that made everything heavy and cold, and a dark atmosphere filled with fear and tension. An extremely cruel image. Edward said he had been a soldier in the First World War. He spoke about fighting directly on the front lines in a merciless war known for its seemingly endless trench systems. There, soldiers lived for weeks and sometimes months in narrow trenches, often knee-deep in mud, surrounded by rats, cold, and constant artillery fire. Rain was not harmless weather. It made everything far worse. It flooded the trenches, turned the ground into thick mud, and stripped soldiers of any chance to feel dry or safe, even though speaking of safety in war is completely absurd. Edward described exactly these conditions. He talked about soaked clothing, stiff hands, and how the cold slowly consumed the body. What stood out most was that this exact weather, darkness, rain, and dampness triggered extreme fear in him in his current life as well, without him being able to explain why. Very, very interesting. The most shocking part, however, were his statements about his death. Edward said he had been killed in the war by a gunshot to the throat. He repeatedly pointed to the exact spot where he experienced these unexplained pains in his present life. For him, the gunshot and the pain were inseparably connected. What makes this case even more unusual than it already is what happened afterward. The more Edward talked about this previous life, the better he felt. His throat pain weakened, the episodes became rarer, and over time they disappeared completely. Not because of medication or treatment, but solely through telling his memories. Absolutely insane. For the treating doctors, this connection was difficult to ignore. The symptoms that no one could previously explain dissolved at the exact moment. When Edward began speaking about his horrific memories, that definitely raised many questions. What amazed everyone, truly everyone, who heard Edward's story were the many emotional details he shared. Edward spoke about the constant fear during the war, about the uncertainty of whether the next day would even come. He talked about loud explosions, gunfire, and never knowing whether you would leave the trench alive. These descriptions aligned remarkably well with what is known about the First World War, a conflict that traumatized millions and left deep scars on history. Regardless of how you evaluate this case, one thing remains crystal clear. Edward's fears, his physical pain, and his detailed memories seem to be connected in a mysterious way. The case of Edward Austrian shows how strongly memories, regardless of where they come from, can influence present life. Now we inevitably have to ask the following questions. Is this boy truly the reincarnation of a soldier who died in the First World War? Have we perhaps all lived many lives, but simply cannot remember them anymore? A very, very fascinating thought. But that was only the beginning. The truly shocking cases are still ahead of us. At this point, a quick question for you. Do you believe in reincarnation? Just write yes or no in the comments below. We're very curious to hear your opinions. Number 9, the disturbing case of Dilukshi Nisanka. Sometimes it isn't a single detail that makes a story so unbelievable, but the age of a child. In 1986, in Sri Lanka, a girl named Dilukshi Nisanka began talking about a previous life before her second birthday. You shouldn't forget that most children at that age can barely speak, let alone form coherent sentences. She repeatedly spoke about a village located around 130 kilometers from her home at the time, and about a stream that played an important role in her stories. Very early on, Dilukshi made it clear that this stream meant nothing harmless to her. She told her family that she had died there in a cruel way, that she had fallen into the water and could no longer get out. Shocking statements you would never expect to hear from the mouth of such a small child. At first, her parents paid little attention to these words, but over time, her descriptions became more specific. Dilukshi spoke about the village, named certain places, and eventually even pointed to the exact spot where she had drowned in a horrifying way. Particularly striking was her extreme fear of water. Every time her mother tried to bathe her, Dilukshi fell into intense panic. She screamed loudly, cried terribly, and could not be calmed down. The mere sight of water alone was enough to trigger this powerful reaction. For her parents, this panic was impossible to explain for a long time. Only much later did they realize that all these things were connected. What makes this case so extraordinary is not only Dilukshi's young age, but above all the number of precise statements she made. In total, she gave more than 20 specific details about her previous life. Details that were later verified, and all of them turned out to be true. Pretty insane. In addition, Dilukshi consistently refused to address her current parents as father and mother. Instead, she repeatedly demanded to be brought to her real mother. For her parents, this was painful to endure, and eventually gave them no peace. After some time, her parents gave in and set out together with Dilukshi to the village she had spoken about so often. As soon as they arrived, something happened that left even the greatest skeptics of reincarnation completely speechless. Suddenly, Dilukshi moved purposefully through the village and, without hesitating for even a second, headed straight toward a specific house. And now things become truly unsettling, because it was exactly the house where the girl who had drowned years earlier had lived. Dilukshi had never been in this village before. So how could she have known all of this? A true goosebumps moment. When Dilukshi then saw the woman who was the mother of the deceased girl, she ran toward her with joy and embraced her, without fear, without hesitation, a moment that brought tears to the eyes of those present. Shortly afterward, Dilukshi led the villagers to the stream, to the exact place where the other girl had lost her life in a horrifying way. The people in the village confirmed the tragic incident. They remembered very well the girl who had drowned there years earlier. The mother of the deceased child reacted deeply shaken. After everything she experienced, she eventually accepted Dilukshi as the reincarnation of her deceased daughter. A scene that was almost unbearable even for outsiders. A profoundly heartbreaking situation. Later, the Icelandic psychologist and author Erlendur Haraldsson took on this case, one of the best-known researchers in the field of reincarnation. He analyzed Dilukshi's statements, spoke with the family and villagers, and carefully verified every single claim. His conclusion was clear. The child's statements matched the real circumstances exactly. Haraldsson described the case of Dilukshi Nisanka as one of the most convincing reincarnation cases he had ever encountered. He said it was simply impossible that this little girl could have known all these things. Deluxi's story later even found its way into a documentary by Storyhouse Productions and was broadcast worldwide. This brought international attention to the case and significantly increased interest in reincarnation research. This led many people to reflect deeply on the following questions. So does reincarnation truly exist? How can you find out whether and how many times you have already lived? And what is the true purpose of reincarnation? Extremely fascinating questions. Subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. It's completely free and helps us continue making videos like these. Thank you very much. Number 8. The Case of Joan Grant. Joan Grant was a British author, born in 1907, whose name remains inseparably linked to one of the most well-known reincarnation cases of the 20th century. From an early age, she reported unusually vivid memories that did not come from her current life. Memories she herself described as fragments of a previous life in ancient Egypt. Very interesting. Grant repeatedly explained that she could not only remember this past life, but also specific information about the construction of the pyramids. She spoke about how they were built, who was involved, and what function they truly served. For her, this was not speculative knowledge, but personal experience. She later processed these memories in literary form in several novels, including Winged Pharaoh and Scarlet Feather. Winged Pharaoh in particular is considered autobiographical in tone and portrays the life of an Egyptian woman during the early dynastic period, with a level of detail that astonished even Egyptologists. It is striking that many of the cultural and religious aspects described by Grant were only confirmed years later through archaeological discoveries. Certain rituals, temple procedures, and social structures she described were barely researched or scientifically verified at the time her books were published, a fact that continues to puzzle critics to this day. Grant's statements about pyramid construction techniques were especially controversial. She claimed that the ancient Egyptians possessed knowledge far beyond what modern historiography recognizes. This extremely advanced knowledge was, according to her, completely lost later on. She spoke of highly developed spiritual masters who directed the construction of the pyramids. Techniques were used that today would be considered impossible. One of these was levitation, the ability to move matter solely through mental force. Grant explained that only in this way could the transport of multi-ton stone blocks be meaningfully understood. Furthermore, she described a deep understanding among the ancient Egyptians of the interaction between matter and mind. According to her, the pyramids were not merely tombs, but precisely engineered energy centers serving specific spiritual purposes. Grant also frequently emphasized the astronomical alignment of the pyramids. The constellation Orion in particular played a central role. She explained that the three great pyramids of Giza resemble Orion's belt in their arrangement and were deliberately aligned with this star formation. In her view, Orion symbolized the realm of the gods in ancient Egypt and the transition of the soul into a higher level of existence. Extremely interesting. What is particularly remarkable is that the connection between the pyramids and the Orion constellation only became publicly known many years later. So where did Grant obtain all this knowledge at the time? According to Grant, even the construction phase of the pyramids was accompanied by rituals and prayers. These ceremonies served to consciously activate and permanently stabilize the energetic properties of the structures. Grant's most extraordinary claim, however, was that the pyramids functioned as energetic portals that allowed communication with higher beings or gods and enabled spiritual insight. A notion considered extreme even within esoteric circles. Grant consistently stated that her books were based on real memories she experienced during deep trance states. A trance is a state of deep mental immersion in which external impressions fade into the background and inner imagery becomes especially vivid. These trances were not deliberately induced, she said, but occurred spontaneously, often accompanied by intense emotional and physical reactions. Her account sparked heated debates worldwide, not only among esoteric thinkers, but also among historians and psychologists. Was Joan Grant simply displaying a vivid imagination? Or were these truly memories from a previous life? And this brings us to the decisive question: how could Joan Grant know details that were not yet known in her time? Where did this information really come from? So was she truly the reincarnation of an Egyptian priestess? An absolutely fascinating story. If you think you've already seen and heard everything, the next case will definitely surprise you. Number 7. The case of Cameron McCauley. Imagine a 5-year-old child repeatedly telling you about a home on a remote island he has never visited. He names people, describes rooms, remembers objects and places, and sounds completely convinced. That is exactly what happened in 2005 in Scotland with a boy named Cameron McCauley. Cameron grew up on the mainland, but very early on he began saying that he actually belonged somewhere else. Again and again he mentioned the island of Barra in the Outer Hebrides, several hundred kilometers away. For Cameron, these were not invented stories. He spoke about them as if he had truly experienced them himself. Particularly striking was his strong emotional attachment to this place. Cameron would become sad whenever he spoke about Barra, and constantly expressed the desire to return there. He did not describe it as a new place he wanted to explore, but as his home, which he painfully missed. His descriptions went far beyond general statements. Cameron spoke, for example, about a family he had lived with there, even naming specific people and describing everyday routines. He explained how the house was structured, how the rooms were arranged, and what the surroundings looked like. He did not speak hesitantly. His statements were clear and precise. Pretty insane. Over time, the details became increasingly specific. Cameron reported airplanes regularly flying over the house, a seemingly minor detail that later drew significant attention when it turned out an airfield was indeed nearby. He also spoke about a black dog and paths around the property that he knew well. One detail appeared again and again in his stories: a boat named the Lexi. Cameron mentioned it casually, as if he knew it personally. His family, however, had no idea what he meant and wondered where he had heard the name. His longing for Barra eventually became too strong to ignore. Cameron repeatedly asked about his other family and showed extremely intense emotional reactions whenever the subject arose. His persistent desire ultimately led his family to seriously investigate the matter. Together, accompanied by a film crew, they traveled to the island. Even during the journey, it was noticeable that Cameron remained unusually calm. He sat attentively, observing the surroundings. His behavior seemed far more serious and mature than one would expect from a child his age. Upon arriving in Barra, it quickly became clear that this was no ordinary visit. Cameron moved across the island with surprising confidence and led his parents directly to a house that matched his descriptions perfectly. The building truly existed and stood near the sea, exactly as he had described. Many of the people he mentioned had passed away by then. Nevertheless, residents of the island confirmed several of his statements. These fascinating correspondences strengthened the impression that Cameron was indeed telling the truth. The moment Cameron entered the house was described by observers as particularly intense. He burst into tears, appeared overwhelmed, and at the same time deeply familiar with the environment, as if returning to a place where he had once spent a great deal of time. The case was later documented in the film The Boy Who Lived Before and broadcast internationally. As a result, Cameron's story reached a global audience and sparked numerous discussions about the possibility of reincarnation. Regardless of how this case is evaluated, one question remains: how could Cameron describe places, details, and connections so precisely that he demonstrably never experienced? How could something like this even be possible? What comes next will change your view of life and death forever. Number 6. The incredible case of Duminda Ratnayake. Sometimes memories of a previous life reveal themselves not just through isolated statements, but through a combination of behavior, interests, and abilities that are impossible to explain. Exactly such a case attracted major attention in Sri Lanka toward the end of the 1990s. The story of a boy whose statements left even the greatest skeptics in astonishment. The boy in question is named Duminda Ratnayake. From early childhood, he began speaking about having once lived as a Buddhist monk. He mentioned a very specific place, the Asgiriya Temple in Kandy, a traditional monastery that has played an important role in the country's religious life for centuries and is part of an ancient monastic tradition. His statements did not seem random or playful. Duminda repeatedly said he had lived there and described in detail tasks, procedures, and daily routines of monastic life that he could not possibly have known. These descriptions did not appear only once, but returned repeatedly over a long period, consistent and without changes or contradictions. His behavior was also striking. Duminda showed strong interest in religious symbols, rituals, and discussions about spiritual topics. He treated sacred objects with respect, observed ceremonies attentively, and displayed a seriousness highly unusual for his age. This attitude shaped his behavior for an extended time and remained inexplicable to outsiders. As he grew older, his desire to visit the temple intensified. For him, it was unquestionably a place he felt deeply connected to. This recurring request eventually led to the visit being arranged. The moment Duminda entered the temple left everyone with chills. He reacted emotionally and suddenly began to cry, a response that surprised observers and showed that this visit carried special meaning for him. His movements on the grounds appeared familiar, as if he belonged there. He pointed out hidden areas, spoke about routines, and navigated as though he had spent extensive time there before. The monks present were shocked and emphasized that it was impossible for Duminda to know all these things. No one could explain how such a young child possessed this knowledge. Particularly remarkable was that Duminda named a deceased monk who had actually lived there and held a leading role in the temple. This astonishing match significantly increased interest among those involved and made the case especially intriguing for researchers. And now things become truly mysterious. Duminda was able to recite verses in Pali, a classical language of Buddhist teachings. This language is normally studied intensively only through religious training and is not accessible to outsiders. That means it is practically impossible for a child to master this language. Absolutely insane. Pali is one of the oldest preserved linguistic forms within the Buddhist tradition and forms the foundation of numerous historical scriptures. Understanding these texts requires years of intensive engagement with religious study. This is not something you casually pick up. The fact that Duminda could reproduce content from it gave his case strong credibility and intensified discussions surrounding it. In the early 2000s, the case was examined by many well-known researchers, including Erlendur Haraldsson and Godwin Samararatne. They documented statements, analyzed his behavior, and evaluated his abilities. Through these investigations, Duminda's case became a frequently discussed example in modern reincarnation studies. Despite his early spiritual orientation, Duminda's life later took a different direction. He did not pursue a permanent monastic path, but eventually turned toward computer science. This shows that unusual childhood memories do not automatically determine the path someone will take later in life. At this point, we inevitably have to ask the following questions. How could this young boy have mastered the ancient language Pali, studied only by highly educated monks? And is Duminda truly the reincarnation of a high-ranking monk from this temple? Who knows? What comes next completely overshadows everything you've heard so far. Number 5. The impressive case of Joey Verwey. There are reports of memories from previous lives that are limited to single events or a single identity. And then there are cases that go far beyond that, involving numerous memories, different roles, and accounts spanning enormous stretches of time. Joey Verwee's story falls exactly into this category. Joey grew up in South Africa and began speaking at the age of just 3 about having experienced things that clearly did not belong to her current life. At first, her family saw this as normal childhood imagination. Children tell stories. Nothing unusual about that, they thought. But it quickly became clear that Joey's statements were not random and did not disappear after a short time. On the contrary, her statements kept returning and became more extensive over time. Her parents therefore began writing down everything Joey said and later brought it up again to check whether she remembered and could repeat the same statements. To their great surprise, Joey was able to recount the content again without difficulty, as if she were describing something she had personally experienced. Pure goosebumps. Joey reported remembering numerous past existences. She did not speak of just one identity, but several. According to later reports, she was able to describe memories from more than 10 different lives, involving different genders, social roles, and living conditions. Some descriptions seemed ordinary, others extraordinarily detailed. Part of her memories involved historical scenarios with concrete actions, situations, and living conditions. She did not limit herself to superficial statements, but described environments, activities, and experiences with remarkable precision. To her family, it did not feel like invented storytelling, but like memories of real experiences. Particularly attention-grabbing were those statements reaching even further back in time. Joey spoke about living in an era in which she encountered large reptile-like creatures she described as dinosaurs. She recounted seeking shelter in a cave to hide from these dangerous animals, a narrative that sparked both amazement and skepticism. What mattered, however, was not only the content of these statements, but their emotional impact. Family members reported that Joey appeared very serious and reacted emotionally while speaking. These were not casual fantasy stories she forgot shortly afterward. The memories kept returning and occupied her over long periods. As she grew older, her reports developed further. She structured her memories more clearly, connected events together, and was able to describe individual experiences in greater detail. This development led to her story gaining attention beyond her private environment and being documented. The more people learned about her case, the more divided opinions became. Some saw clear indications of memories from previous existences. Others viewed her statements as expressions of childhood imagination or psychological processes. The case became an example of how differently such accounts can be interpreted. What remains certain, however, a preschool-aged child spoke about numerous identities, roles, and living conditions, things far beyond what she herself could have experienced. And this is where the crucial questions begin. Why is it most often children, often very young ones, who remember previous lives? And why do many of these memories later disappear, a pattern observed in nearly all reincarnation cases? Is reincarnation perhaps a fundamental part of our existence? A very, very fascinating thought. What follows next pushes us to the limits of what we believe possible. Number 4. The case of Jenny Cockle. What if you have memories that don't belong to your own life? What if you see scenes as a child that you can't explain, and years later, you discover they match a real person? That is exactly what the case of Jenny Cockle is about, an English woman born in 1953 who attracted worldwide attention in the 1990s. Her unusual experiences began very early. At around 4 years old, she repeatedly had the same dreams and images. In them, she saw herself as a mother in Ireland, surrounded by many children. The strongest feeling was having to leave those children behind. These impressions were so vivid that as a child she drew houses, paths, and landscapes, even though she had never been to Ireland. As she grew older, these images did not fade, quite the opposite. She began to realize that she was remembering a previous life. She even named a name, Mary Sutton. Instead of dismissing these thoughts, she decided as an adult to systematically search for clues. This happened at a time when internet research did not yet exist. She worked with maps, archives, and church records. After an extended search, she actually found a matching trace. Historical records revealed a woman named Mary Sutton who had lived in the Malahide region near Dublin and died in 1932. Almost all the facts matched what Cockle had described. That was the point when she finally decided to travel to Ireland herself. There she verified her memories step by step. She recognized streets and areas she had previously known only from her inner images. During her stay, an extraordinary moment occurred. Jenny Cockle met several of Mary Sutton's children, who were by then significantly older than she was. Decades after their mother's death, they encountered a stranger toward whom they nevertheless felt an unexpected closeness, an emotionally intense meeting that deeply moved everyone involved. Particularly striking was her description of the house: whitewashed walls, a slightly sagging roof, and a specific room layout. Details such as an open hearth with hooks for pots or a vegetable patch beside the house were later confirmed by relatives. It became even more concrete in her everyday descriptions. She spoke of mattresses being regularly refilled with chaff, a typical practice of earlier times. On one occasion, too much had been stuffed in, making the mattress impossible to fit through a doorway. This seemingly trivial memory was confirmed by those involved. It is precisely such small details that give her story such credibility. She also mentioned individual events. She described a rabbit caught in a trap, an incident confirmed by one of the children. She likewise remembered often waiting at a pier. It later turned out that Mary Sutton regularly waited there for her son, who worked nearby. Such connections only emerged after conversations on site. In addition, she described personalities within the family. Relatives confirmed that her character descriptions were accurate, describing one son, for instance, as particularly humorous and playful. She recognized typical clothing worn by the mother and spoke about daily household routines. Many of these statements had been written down before she had direct contact with family members. Later, her memories were compiled and compared with the family's statements. According to the investigations involved, there was a very high level of agreement in almost all aspects. How does someone obtain so many small personal details, especially at a time without the internet and without direct access to those involved? Is Jenny Cockle truly the reincarnation of Mary Sutton? So, is this proof that reincarnation exists? A quick question for you before we continue with the next case. Have you ever experienced déjà vu? Many people at least know a milder version of this feeling. You go somewhere for the first time, and yet everything feels familiar. Or you meet someone for the first time and instantly feel a strong connection. Have you ever experienced something like that? Just write it in the comments below. We're curious to hear your experiences. Number 3. The case of O'Neill Mahmood. The case of O'Neill Mahmood is considered one of the most astonishing reports connected to reincarnation and unusual linguistic phenomena. It concerns a 3-year-old boy from Israel who drew major attention in 2018 because he spoke fluent English with a British accent, even though he grew up in an environment where he had virtually no contact with the English language or culture. Quite interesting. O'Neill began speaking at around 2 years old, like many children at that age. At first, he produced incomprehensible sounds, as children typically do while taking their first steps into language. Since he comes from an Arabic-speaking Druze family, his parents naturally expected his first words to be Arabic. But that is not what happened. Instead, he began speaking English, and in a form his parents could not comprehend. No one in his environment spoke English with him, and according to the family, he had no access to media or instruction through which he could have learned the language. Particularly strange was that he did not know the Arabic meanings of the English words. A speech therapist and clinical linguist examined the boy and reached the interesting conclusion that his English ability roughly matched the level of a 5-year-old from an English-speaking environment, while his Arabic skills were essentially non-existent. As a result, he could barely communicate within his Arabic-speaking surroundings. How can something like this be explained? Why is this child able to speak a language that no one seemingly taught him? One possible explanation is a mysterious phenomenon known as xenoglossy. Xenoglossy describes reports of people speaking or understanding a language without consciously learning it. The subject has been studied for decades in parapsychology and repeatedly appears in discussions about reincarnation. A well-known researcher in this field was psychiatrist Ian Stevenson of the University of Virginia. Over several decades, he documented thousands of reports about children who showed memories or abilities from previous lives. In individual cases, he also examined language phenomena in which children produced words or entire passages in foreign languages. Later researchers, such as Jim Tucker, continued this work and investigated cases where children demonstrated knowledge or abilities they could not have learned. In doing so, it was always examined whether exposure to the language through media or environment could be ruled out, because these factors are crucial for a serious evaluation. A classic example of xenoglossy would be a child suddenly beginning to speak a language they demonstrably never heard or learned. Such reports are very rare, but they do exist. Skeptics, however, always emphasize that alternative explanations, such as unconscious absorption of information, must be considered. Nevertheless, the underlying idea fascinates many people. Could it be that language abilities or memories originate from previous lives? According to this theory, experiences and knowledge do not simply disappear, but remain preserved, perhaps within a kind of storage of the soul. Memories and abilities are said to be retained there, normally inaccessible consciously, yet able to surface again under certain circumstances. In the case of O'Neill Mahmood, some experts interpret his language ability within exactly this context. They suspect that knowledge from a previous life may have carried over, an idea not scientifically confirmed, but one that explains the immense interest in such cases. Many ask themselves, do memories truly end with death? Or do they continue independently of the physical body? Could that explain why certain abilities, places, or impressions feel familiar without us understanding why? That would certainly be a very interesting explanation. The connection between xenoglossy and reincarnation remains a fascinating subject that continues to be debated and studied, and that is precisely why puzzling cases like this attract so much attention. Believe me, the next case is one of the strangest you've ever heard. Number 2. The case of James Leininger. What if a small child knows things about the Second World War that he could not possibly know? What if he names people, places, and technical details long before he is even old enough to engage with such topics? That is exactly what made the case of James Leininger one of the best-known modern reports about reincarnation. James was born in 1998 in Louisiana in the United States and grew up in a completely ordinary family. As a toddler, he developed a strong fascination with airplanes early on. His parents initially considered this perfectly normal. Many children like machines or toy planes, nothing unusual. But it soon became clear that his interest ran remarkably deep. Now things become unsettling. At around 2 years old, severe nightmares began. James woke up screaming every night, kicking wildly and repeatedly shouting phrases like, "I'm crashing," "It's on fire," "I can't get out." These sentences repeated again and again. His parents were disturbed because such a young child does not normally describe concrete crash situations. Shortly afterward, he began talking about airplanes during the day, using technical terms his parents did not know. He spoke about Corsair aircraft, an actual American fighter plane used in the Second World War. Particularly striking was that he described technical characteristics correctly, such as details about drop tanks under the wings, things normally known only by specialists. Even more astonishing was another statement from James. He said he had launched from a ship called Natoma. His parents initially assumed pure imagination, but after researching, They quickly discovered that the USS Natoma Bay was a real escort aircraft carrier deployed in the Pacific during the Second World War. The more they investigated, the more clues they found. Mission records showed that a pilot named James M. Houston, Jr. flew from that carrier and died in 1945 during the Battle of Iwo Jima. His aircraft was shot down and crashed into the ocean, exactly the scenario their son repeatedly described. James also said that his plane had been hit by the Japanese and caught fire. He described a burning cockpit, the sensation of crashing and sinking into the water. For his parents, it was extremely difficult to comprehend how a toddler could develop such detailed descriptions. Further statements deepened the mystery even more. The boy named fellow pilots and spoke about procedures aboard aircraft carriers. His parents contacted former crew members, and some of the details he mentioned could indeed be historically verified. Even his drawings showed airplanes with surprisingly accurate features. During their research, the family attended reunions of former Natoma Bay crew members. James met men who had experienced the war firsthand. Observers reported that he asked unusually specific questions about aircraft and missions and showed remarkable familiarity with onboard procedures, behavior that left all present veterans speechless. The case was eventually examined thoroughly by researchers, including Jim Tucker from the University of Virginia, who studies reports of past life memories. Researchers conducted interviews, collected records, and compared statements to determine which claims could actually be confirmed. Of course, there are differing perspectives. Critical voices argue that media exposure, conversations, or selective memory may have played a role. Supporters, however, see the number of specific correspondences as evidence of an extraordinary phenomenon. No one, truly no one, can explain this case in a logical way. Yet that is exactly what makes this case so fascinating. It shows how complex memory can be, especially when it appears in very young children who clearly had no access to the relevant information. So is James the reincarnation of a man who served in the Second World War and died in a plane crash? An absolutely fascinating story. The case of James Leininger is among the most discussed modern examples in reincarnation research, not because it explains everything, but because it raises new questions many are still trying to answer. Ready for the final case? Then pay close attention now. Number 1, the car accident. The case of Daniel Jurdy is considered one of the most fascinating stories connected to reincarnation. Some people even see it as proof. This case attracted particular attention because Daniel's statements began very early and repeated themselves with remarkable consistency over many years. It was precisely this continuity that led his family not to dismiss them as temporary childhood fantasy, but to increasingly engage seriously with their possible background. Daniel was born in 1969 in Beirut and showed unusual remarks, even as a toddler, that differed from typical childhood storytelling. He spoke about actually belonging somewhere else and repeatedly mentioned the name Ibrahim. At the same time, he expressed the desire to be taken home, a wish that initially had no recognizable basis for his parents, since there was no corresponding person or connection in their environment. As his language developed, his statements became more detailed and structured in content. He described driving fast cars and spoke about having died in an accident. He recounted particularly vividly that he had been trapped in the vehicle after the crash and could not be freed. These descriptions were emotionally intense and repeated over long periods, clearly distinguishing them from simple fantasy stories. As time went on, Daniel named a specific location, the village of Kafarmata near the Lebanese coast. Since he had never been there and no known family connections existed, his parents eventually decided to investigate. They contacted local authorities to determine whether an accident matching Daniel's descriptions had ever been recorded. The response revealed a surprising match. In Kafarmata, a serious traffic accident had indeed occurred in which 2 men died, Rashid Khadij and a man named Ibrahim. According to reports, The vehicle overturned multiple times, and one occupant became trapped in the wreckage with no possibility of rescue. This information gave Daniel's statements strong credibility and deeply shocked his family. Daniel was then taken to Kfar Mata to see whether further connections could be found. There, he met members of the affected family and reportedly showed immediate recognition of certain individuals. He remembered names, spoke about former acquaintances, and moved through parts of the environment with a natural familiarity that showed how comfortable he was there. These encounters were emotionally charged and further intensified attention toward the case. Beyond the major correspondences, smaller everyday details also played a role in the overall evaluation. For example, Daniel showed a pronounced preference for bananas, which the Khadig family immediately associated with Rashid, as he had reportedly been known to eat several every day. Such seemingly minor observations strengthened, for those involved, the impression of a possible connection. Equally striking was his behavior toward cars. Daniel developed a strong aversion to riding in them and often refused to get into a vehicle, even when this meant longer journeys for him. Instead, he preferred to take the extra time and walk. Since no event in his own life explained this reaction, this behavior was also viewed as a remarkable part of the overall picture. The case gained further attention when a photo of Rashid Khadige was compared with Daniel's appearance, with observers noting strong similarities. Such assessments are naturally subjective and difficult to classify scientifically, yet were considered part of the discussion alongside the other statements. The multitude of elements, location references, accident descriptions, recognized individuals, behavioral patterns, and confirmed events led to this case being repeatedly included in discussions about reincarnation. At the same time, critics emphasize alternative explanations, which is why the case continues to be evaluated from different perspectives today. It is precisely this combination of confirmed details and open questions that makes the case so distinctive. It provides no clear answers, but it compels you to reflect on memory and whether experiences might persist beyond death. So how did Daniel know the name Ibrahim, the name of one of the men who lost his life in that car accident? And is Daniel truly the